Hawaii calls. When we got to Nob Hill, I couldn't believe my eyes. Our houses had survived. From the Utah, it looked like the Japanese had bombed every inch of this side of the island. But there they were, the little homes still standing along Battleship Row, the last line of defense between Ford Island and the Japanese attack. I ducked instinctively as huge spouts of water erupted offshore, 4 or 5 times taller than the tops of the Maryland and the Tennessee. It was hard to see what condition the fighting ships were in, but with all the fire and smoke, I knew it couldn't be good. The Battleship Arizona, parked just behind my house, was a raging inferno. The air was heavy with the smell of burning oil. I almost couldn't hear myself think for the crash and rumble of the ongoing battle. Stanley and I ran for his house. I felt the pull of my own bungalow next door, but I knew better. Dad said that Mom and Ginny had left for the dungeon. Shiny things covered our front yards like hail, and I slowed down to look at them. They were the metal clips that held strings of bullets together. Airplanes spat them out when they fired their machine guns. You could usually find a few clips like these at the airfield after the Navy pilots had run shooting drills. But these clips weren't American. They couldn't be. We didn't have that many planes in the sky. That meant they were Japanese bullet casings. I stared at the sea of metal clips strewn all over the grass. How many times must Japanese planes have flown back and forth over the island with their guns blazing to fill up our yards like this? "Mom!" Stanley cried, throwing open his front door. "Mom! Are you still here?" I hurried to follow him. Stanley and I split up to search a small house. "Mom! Mom!" I heard Stanley call in one of the bedrooms. I ran into the living room. Wherever Mrs. Summers was, she left without turning off the radio. It was tuned to the KGMB broadcast out of Honolulu, and Webley Edwards, the host of Hawaii Calls, was breathlessly reporting on the attack that was happening right outside the window. "Civilian employees are being told to not, I repeat, not report to the base," he said. "The highway between Honolulu and Pearl is being strafed by enemy aircraft. Military authorities are warning everyone in Honolulu to stay off the roads and not block traffic. This is not a drill. Pearl Harbor Naval Base is under attack." "No kidding, really?" I said sarcastically. "Stay tuned for more information as it becomes available," he said. There was a second or two of dead air, and then Webb Edwards, in a voice more like a stunned friend and less like a radio announcer, said, "Folks, this is the real McCoy." That made me stop. I'd heard that phrase before, but I never thought of how it was also my last name, McCoy. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," Webb added dramatically, "your national anthem. You may never hear it again." A record needle popped, and a scratchy recording of the Star-Spangled Banner blasted out from the radio speakers. I got goosebumps. You may never hear it again? Did that mean that the Hawaiian Islands were about to be invaded by Japanese troops? I slumped. But of course they were. I had been so stupid. That had been why they were attacking from the air first, to soften us up for a ground invasion. "Frank, come quick! Help!" Stanley cried from out back, and the bottom dropped out of my world. The Japanese invasion must have already begun. Buried. I hurried to the back door, sure I was going to see Japanese Marines waiting up on shore, rifles and bayonets at the ready. Instead, what I saw was Stanley's mom, on her knees in the backyard, and Stanley desperately trying to pull her to her feet. Ships and trees burned behind them, and as I stood staring, a Zero burst out of the smoke, its guns blazing at something farther inland. Stanley ducked as the plane roared by, but his mom ignored it. What in the Sam Hill? What was Mrs. Summers doing? "Mom, stop!" Stanley cried. He looked up and saw me. "Frank, help me get her out of here." I banged open the screen door and ran for Stanley and his mom. When I got close, I saw that Mrs. Summers was hacking away at the ground with her little garden trowel. She'd cut a long, shallow trench and was trying to make it deeper, her hands and dress all dirty. "What's she doing?" I cried. "Stanley, we can't be out here." Japanese planes were strafing the water right behind us, and I cowered as a fireball exploded on the West Virginia, 2 ships down on Battleship Row. "I know," Stanley said. He looked up at me with panic in his eyes. "She won't listen." Mrs. Summers fought Stanley off and slashed at the ground again with all her might. "I have to bury it, all of it," she yelled. "They can't find it in the house." That's when I saw the small pile of things beside her on the grass. I recognized some of them at once. They were the Japanese heirlooms from the Summers dining room, the framed pictures of Stanley's ancestors, the woodblock prints of Mount Fuji, the family's beloved samurai sword. There were also Japanese books and a stack of letters addressed in Japanese. Mrs. Summers was digging a hole to bury the whole pile. But why? "Mom, please, stop," Stanley begged. "I don't understand." "Can't you see? America and Japan are at war," Mrs. Summers said, still digging. "And you and me, we look like the people who are dropping the bombs." I suddenly remembered the Japanese pilot Stanley and I had seen flying by, with his smiling, waving tail gunner. I remembered the anger I'd felt at them for destroying everything I loved, the loathing I'd felt. A ball formed in the pit of my stomach, and I took a step back. Mrs. Summers was right. If I'd felt that angry, other people would too. A lot of other people. "What? But no," Stanley said. "We're Americans. We were born here." "You don't understand," Mrs. Summers said, flinging dirt over her shoulder, her eyes frantic. "Where we were born, how we were raised, none of that will matter now." I'd never seen an adult so panicked, so frightened, and it scared me. But Stanley was right. Even though Hawaii was a territory and not a state, he and his mom were U.S. citizens, Americans, just like me and all the other transplants at Pearl, just like all the Pacific Islanders and native Hawaiians and the other Japanese Americans who were born here. But my own thoughts had betrayed me. Back on the tarmac, when we'd been with our dads, I thought the Navy brass were right to be on guard for spies and saboteurs because there were so many Japanese Americans living here. But why had I assumed that those people would be spies? I gasped to myself. I had done to every Japanese American in Hawaii exactly what Mrs. Summers had just warned Stanley would happen. I judged them based only on what they looked like and where their ancestors were from. Stanley's mom grabbed his arm, making him jump. "You've grown up in a bubble here in Hawaii, Stanley," she said, her face twisted in anguish. "It was so perfect, and I love that for you. But it's over now, and you don't know how it is everywhere else, how it will be here after all of this. You and me, Stanley, we have to bury who we are." Stanley staggered back like he'd been slapped, and that's when I finally understood what Stanley's dad had been trying to tell him in the airfield. Mr. Summers had realized how people would react to the attack, how it would be for his wife and son. Stanley and his mom were going to have to look out for each other while Mr. Summers was at war, because things were going to be very different for both of them from now on. Mrs. Summers swept the pile of family heirlooms into the hole she dug and started brushing dirt on top. "Mom, stop," Stanley said, trying to pull her away. "Frank, help me get her." Stanley never got to finish. Suddenly, there was a great sucking sound, and then, boom! The biggest, loudest explosion I'd ever heard lifted me up and threw me across the yard. A volcano erupts. Thwack! I hit the back of Stanley's house and fell to the ground face first. All the air was gone from my lungs, and I couldn't get it back. I was suffocating, dying. Twisted steel plates and pieces of machinery came hurtling at me, tearing up grave-sized divots in the lawn and punching giant holes in the wall of Stanley's house. But I couldn't breathe. I clawed at the ground, at my shirt, pounding my chest, and suddenly, gasp. I was breathing again, gulping down great rasping lungfuls of air that felt like sandpaper in my throat. Another explosion made me flinch, then another and another. Boom, boom, boom. Explosion on top of explosion on top of explosion, like the grand finale of a fireworks show, each one shaking the ground and rattling my teeth. A bomb must have hit the Arizona's ammunition room, I thought. And then, croom, I saw the USS Arizona rise up out of the water and a giant fireball. It bent and buckled, and then the 600-foot, 30,000-ton steel battleship snapped in half like a twig, falling back to earth in pieces. Vroom! I bounced in the air as the Arizona slammed back down into the harbor, and I landed on my side with another painful thud. Water swept up on shore like a tsunami, flooding half of Stanley's backyard. And still, the Arizona burned and exploded. Boom, boom, boom. What had been a battleship was now an erupting volcano of fire and smoke. Rivets popped and shot in every direction, and the air became a hailstorm of oil and steel and flames. I covered my head and curled up into a ball as 1,000 million things that made up a battleship came raining down on me. Anchors and hawsers, hatches, and pieces of wooden deck, bits of hull, claws for tying off lines, broken antennas, busted steering columns, crumpled machine guns, and body parts. I turned away and gagged. With tears in my eyes, I remembered sitting in my bedroom window last night and listening to the movie playing on the fantail of the Arizona. There'd been more than 1,000 sailors on the USS Arizona, and most of them had been on the ship when she exploded. How many of them had survived? Looking up at the angry red firestorm and the death-dark smoke that poured from the ship, at the bodies that littered the backyards of Nob Hill, I couldn't imagine that anyone had. The shrapnel and debris stopped falling, and I knew I had to stand. I was tired and sore, and my throat and lungs still burned, but I had to get out of here, away from the horror, to Mom and Ginny in the dungeon. Stanley and his mother were huddled nearby, and I staggered to them. They were as scratched and bleeding and shaken as I was, but none of us was badly hurt, not on the outside at least. I watched in shock as Mrs. Summers started to crawl back to the hole she'd been digging, to finish burying her in Stanley's past while the world burned around us. Stanley and I got to her first and dragged her away. She was too weak, too shaken to really resist this time. Stanley said something to me, but I couldn't hear a word of it. My ears were buzzing from the explosion. "We have to get to the dungeon." That's what I was thinking, and I assumed that's what Stanley was trying to tell me. It was the only thing worth saying. And then I saw what had happened to my house. No going back. My house was no more. Some part of the Arizona, a gun turret, a part of the bridge, had crashed right into our living room, and the whole house had collapsed in on itself. Everything that was left was on fire. Somewhere in the back of my brain, a little voice said, "Go get some water, a bucket of sand. You have to put the fire out." But the biggest part of my brain already knew it was hopeless. The house was a complete loss. Everything we owned was gone. All our clothes, our photos, our radio, all the souvenirs from Dad's previous assignments, the mystery novels my mom loved to read, Ginny's baseball trophies, my comic book collection, and all the comic scripts I wrote. I realized with a pang of grief. Notebook after notebook, years of work. It was all burning up in the fire. I started toward my house to see what I could save, but Mr. Summers held me back. Mrs. Summers held me back. She looked haggard and heartbroken, but she'd come to her senses. She shook her head. The past was dead and buried, for all of us. There was no going back. Together, the three of us hobbled past Stanley's burning house to the road that ringed the island. No fire trucks came driving up, no ambulances, no military vehicles. The Arizona, the dead sailors, our destroyed houses, they were all just one more disaster in a day of disasters. Above us, Japanese planes burst in and out of the smoky darkness like monsters from a dark closet. I saw a plane trailing smoke spin down into the water and crash, and my heart caught in my throat. Was that an American plane or a Japanese plane? What if that was Dad? In all the chaos, there was no way to know. It took a lifetime to stagger a few hundred yards to Admiral Bellinger's house, but Stanley and his mom and I got there at last. We headed straight for the dungeon. Two boys stood guard nervously near the entrance, and ice crawled across my skin when I saw who they were. Arthur Edwards and Johnny Ross, the bullies who'd beat up Stanley. But we surely all had bigger things to worry about now, didn't we? Stanley and his mother and I moved toward the entrance of the dungeon, and Arthur and Johnny stepped in our way. "Oh, come on," I said. "You come on in, McCoy," said Arthur. "But no Japs allowed." He stared right at Stanley and his mom. I gasped. Stanley jerked back, looking hurt and confused. His mother had just warned him people would treat him this way, but neither he nor I had expected to see it so soon. "We're Americans," said Stanley. "Yeah, well, you look Japanese," said Johnny. "Stop this nonsense," Mrs. Summers snapped at Arthur and Johnny. "You know us. My husband worked with your fathers. You go to school with Stanley." "Not for long," said Johnny. "We heard the Japs have already landed at Mary Point," said Arthur. "And that the Japs who live here are storming the gates of Pearl Harbor with guns and clubs," said Johnny. I didn't know if the invasion rumors were true or not, but I knew the Japanese Americans in Honolulu would never attack the army base. They had zero reason to. Half of them worked here. "That's stupid, and you know it," I said. Arthur turned on Stanley. "Well, when the Japs do come, who are you going to shoot? Us or them?" Stanley looked more confused than ever. I wouldn't. I could never," he stammered. This was so screwy. I knew Stanley. They did too. He was as American as the rest of us. He was a card-carrying member of Captain America's Sentinels of Liberty, for crying out loud. "You and your Jap mom can go die in the Jap attack," Johnny said to Stanley, and he spat on the ground at his feet. Mrs. Summers gasped, and I felt my blood boil. Before I knew what I was doing, before I can even worry about getting hurt, I threw myself at Johnny, fist swinging. The good fight. I'd never punched anybody before, and it was exhilarating and painful. Turned out Johnny had bones under that stupid face, and my knuckles stung every time I connected. But I was just as big as Johnny, and he hadn't expected me to jump him, so it took a minute before he started hitting back. "Frank, don't!" Mrs. Summers yelled, but I didn't stop. I hadn't stuck up for Stanley yesterday, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Arthur was on me in seconds, trying to pull me away. Then Stanley was there, kicking and punching for all he was worth. "Stanley, stop!" his mother shouted. But we were in it now, fists and feet flying. I took a quick look to see if Stanley was okay, and Johnny decked me. I staggered but didn't go down. My cheekbone stung something awful, though, and when I wiped my lip on with my wrist, I came away with blood. Suddenly I realized how banged up I was from everything that had happened that day. I had cuts and scrapes all over me. Bruises blossomed painfully on my back, my legs, and my arms. My clothes were soaked and torn and bloody, and I sagged with exhaustion. I must have looked rough. Last time I had been hurt anywhere close to this bad was the incident, and I'd run from everything dangerous ever since. There was a part of me that wanted to run even now, a big part of me. But there was an even bigger part of me that knew that standing up for my friend was right, that this was a good fight, one worth getting hurt for. You're braver than you think, Frank McCoy. Johnny hit me again, and I hit him back. I hadn't picked this fight, and neither had Stanley, and I swung with all the righteous anger of the attacked. Johnny was about to come at me again, but then he saw something over my shoulder and froze. I thought he was trying the old look behind you trick to take my eyes off him, but then I noticed Stanley. He was gaping at something behind me too, his eyes wide. I turned. Shambling up the hill toward us was a monster straight out of a Saturday matinee. It was shaped like a man, but it was hunched low and covered all over in black ooze. 2 red eyes blazed up at us from underneath the slime, and its white teeth flashed in a terrifying grimace. The monster pointed an oily finger at its throat and gurgled, as though threatening to eat us alive, and I screamed. The dungeon. I took a horrified step back. So did Johnny and Arthur and Stanley, our fight suddenly forgotten. And then Mrs. Summers did the most extraordinary thing. She ran toward the monster, rather than away from it. "It's a sailor," she cried. "Help get him inside." I blinked, and suddenly I could see it. The hunched, shambling form was actually a young man, completely naked but for the gun belt and pistol he wore. Whether he'd been nude to start with, or his shoes, shirts, and shirt had been blown off him and burned away, I didn't know. Slimy black oil covered him from head to foot. "Stanley, Frank, hurry," Mrs. Summers said. She ignored how ugly the man looked and wrapped her arms around his swaying body. He must have oil in his throat." Stanley dashed toward his mother and I followed. Together, we helped the wounded sailor through the entrance of the dungeon. This time, Arthur and Johnny stood back and let us go by without challenging us. Most of Ford Island neighbors were packed inside the shelter, and I immediately picked Mom and Ginny out of the crowd. I felt a swell of relief. They were alive and safe. Ginny was sitting with the Dawson twins, who she used to babysit. She smiled and started to wave to me, but her look turned to horror when she saw the creature Stanley and I were helping support. Mrs. Harding from 3 doors down paled and wobbled like she might faint, and Arthur's sister, Maxine, who I suspected had a crush on me, started screaming. So did Charlie Moore and the Dawson twins, and soon all the kids were freaking out, young and old, and some of the adults, too. "That's enough," my mom said, her voice cutting through the hullabaloo. She marched toward us, and I felt the urge to stand up straight like a soldier at attention. "This man could be your husband, your father, your brother," she told the other people in the dungeon. "He needs our help, not our bawling." Some of the little kids kept crying, and Ginny went to comfort them. But Mom's words shut everybody else up. Commodore McCoy had taken charge. Mom gave me a quick hug as she swept by. "I'm so glad you're safe. We'll talk more in a minute," she told me, and I nodded. The sailor needed help first. "Let's get that area by the door clear and lay out some blankets," Mom ordered. "If one sailor's found us here, more are sure to follow. Charlotte, Elizabeth, come with me to get some water." The Navy wives and moms immediately got to work. Like the men who'd swarmed the deck of the Utah after the attack started, the women were in various states of dress and appearance. Some wore jeans and sweatshirts. Others had on dresses or skirts and short-sleeved shirts. A few had taken a moment to wrap up their hair in scarves or throw on a baseball cap. Mrs. Harding still had metal curlers in her hair, while Charlie's mom was entirely made up and wearing her Sunday best. Jenny was still wearing her pajamas. She looked at me again from across the room and nodded, relieved I was okay, but she didn't come over. She had her hands full with the kids, which was good because she for sure would have asked me about Brooks, and I didn't know what to say. Stanley and I helped lower the sailor onto the pile of blankets the women had thrown together, and then we stepped back to give the women room to work. "The battleships," the sailor rasped when my mom had gotten a little water down his throat. He clutched at her arm. "They're all on fire." I shivered, remembering the inferno the Arizona had become. How many other ships had gone up in flames? How many other sailors had been burned like this? "It's all right. You're safe now," Mom told the sailor. She backed away as the woman with first aid training took over. "Those dirty Germans!" cried a younger boy named Henry. "Hush," his mother told him. "It's the Japanese." I glanced at Stanley. He looked grim-faced and sullen. I noticed other people looking at him suspiciously. Him and his mom. I huffed. The other people in the dungeon were afraid. I knew that. But fear was no excuse for them to be distrustful. I wanted to yell at them, to tell them that Stanley was as American as the rest of them. But Stanley's mom pulled him away. I was going to follow them to make sure Stanley was okay, but suddenly my mom was back, wrapping me up in a desperate hug. "Frank, I was so worried about you," she said. She held me at arm's length and examined my cuts and bruises. "Were you on the Utah when the attack started?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "The Utah capsized, and we jumped off and swam to Ford." Mom's eyes went wide, but she quickly shook off all the terrible things she had to be imagining and put on a brave smile. "All that swimming practice paid off, I guess," she said, and hugged me again. I told her about running into Dad on the airfield and how he and the ground crew had gone against orders to fight back. She paled a bit at that, but then she nodded. She understood. That was Dad's job. It was always dangerous when Dad went up in the plane, just more so now. A bomb hit outside, shaking the reinforced concrete walls of the bunker and making dust rain down from the ceiling. A baby wailed, and his ashen-faced mother hugged him tight, making him cry even harder. The roar from the battle outside was muted, but we still knew it was going on. "This place is really old. What if the ceiling falls in?" I said to my mom. I didn't want to go there, didn't want to get sucked into a whirlpool of fear again, but I could feel it pulling me in. What if the entrance gets blocked and we're trapped? What if the Japanese really are invading and we get captured? What if... Mom put a hand to my chest. "I know, sweetheart," she said. "I know. But you're safe now." Save for her, she said, acknowledging my usual comeback with a knowing smile. And you and Stanley did the right thing, helping get this sailor inside. I looked around for Stanley and saw him huddled in a corner with his mom. They were talking quietly, Stanley frowning and his mom sadly shaking her head. Even though the dungeon was small, none of the other people stood near them, and I saw a teenage girl named Margaret glancing nervously their way. I felt the heat rise in my face, and my fists clenched again. Nobody had treated Stanley and his mom like this before the attack, so why were they treating them any differently now? I'm just thankful that Brooks was there to look out for you on the Utah, Mom said, and I jumped. Brooks. Mom didn't know. My heart climbed into my throat at the thought of him back there, floating in the water, his dead eyes staring at me, reproaching me. Mom, I said, my voice cracking, Brooks is... A little kid screamed. There was another burned, oil-covered sailor in the doorway, this time held up by Arthur and Johnny. Mom broke away from me and hurried to the wounded man. Help him get against the wall, she told another Navy wife. Here, let's tear up that bathrobe and make towels to clean him off. And Mom was off again, taking charge. I looked over to where Ginny was sitting. Our eyes met, and she handed off one of the crying kids to another girl and started to cross the room, toward me. Oh no, she was coming to ask me about Brooks. I was sure of it. How was I going to tell her that Brooks was dead? What was I going to say? It's my fault your boyfriend got killed? I couldn't do it. Not here. Not now. My heart hammered in my chest, and I looked around for some way to escape. But there's nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. What was I going to do? The Sandman. Ginny, Mom called. Can you bring over some water, please? Another wounded sailor had staggered into the dungeon, and Ginny peeled away to help. I sagged with relief, but I wouldn't be able to avoid my sister forever. More oil-covered sailors found the dungeon, and very quickly the First World War bunker became a makeshift hospital for refugees from what was shaping up to be the Second World War. Some of the sailors lurched in on their own, but others were carried up the hill from the harbor by their crewmates. I was tearing bedsheets into bandages when Arthur's sister, Maxine, came over. Hey, Frank, she said, need some help? Sure, I said. Maxine sat down close beside me. I worried when you weren't here with your mom and your sister, she told me. Oh, I said. Yeah, I was on the Utah when the attack started. We got hit by torpedoes and the ship turned all the way over. Maxine's eyes went wide. Oh my gosh, you must have been so scared, she said, and put her hand on mine. I felt my cheeks warm up. Hey, I said, jumping to my feet. I see Stanley doing something over there. We should go help. Maxine glanced at Stanley, then back at me. The moony look in her eyes had faded, replaced by something else. Disappointment? Disgust? Fear? I think I'll stay here, she said coolly, and suddenly any interest I might have had in Maxine disappeared forever. Right, okay, I said, and I crossed the room to Stanley. To make room for new patients, he was clearing out empty crates that had been stored in the dungeon. Need help? I asked. Stanley didn't say anything back. He kept his eyes on the crates. Hey, are you still upset about what Arthur and Johnny said? I asked quietly. I glanced across the room at Maxine, who was purposefully not looking in my direction anymore. Ignore them. They're idiots. It's not just that. It's everything, Stanley said at last. Arthur and Johnny, my mom burying our stuff, the looks everybody's giving me in here. He shook his head. It's like the Sandman hit me with sleeping gas, and I'm trapped in a nightmare. You've got to be more like Plastic Man, I said. You know, I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you. It's easy for you to say, Stanley muttered, and started dragging a crate toward the front door. I hurried to pick up the other side. Hey, did I do something wrong? I asked. Stanley sighed. I don't know, he said. He finally looked up at me. I don't need you to fight my battles for me, okay? I pulled back and frowned. What do you mean? Outside, with Arthur and Johnny, you just started throwing punches. I was dumbfounded. I thought this was what you wanted me to do, I told him. Yesterday you were mad when I didn't fight. That's because you stood there while I was getting beat up, said Stanley. So this time I jumped in first. You said to yourself, a real hero steps in when other people are getting hurt. This was different, said Stanley. Let me choose my own battles, okay? Then when I do, you back me up. Okay, fine. I threw up my hands. I was just trying to help, I said peevishly. Help means help, said Stanley. It doesn't mean fight for me. It means fight with me. I still didn't understand the difference, but now wasn't the time to figure it out. We got to the front door with the crate, and I stopped. We're not taking all the way outside, are we? We got to make room for more wounded, Stanley told me. But they're still dropping bombs out there, I argued. I could hear the bombs and pops even in here. Well, just be a second, said Stanley. You're braver than you think. You're braver than you think, I told myself. And I took a deep breath and followed Stanley outside. There was a small stack of boxes and things people had moved out of the dungeon already, and Stanley and I hurried to throw our crate on the pile. Down the hill, thick black clouds of smoke roiled up from the wrecks of battleships, blocking our view of the harbor. Japanese planes still zoomed by overhead, strafing everything, including the bloody, oil-covered sailors dragging themselves up to the dungeon. Let's get back inside, I cried, turning for the door. Stanley put an arm to my chest and pushed me back behind the pile of crates. He put a finger to his lips, and I shut up and listened. There were voices from the other side of the crates. Arthur and Johnny had been replaced at the entrance of the dungeon by an actual Marine guard, and we could hear Charlie's mom talking to him. I see that you have a pistol, Mrs. Moore said. Yes, ma'am, the Marine said. When the Japanese invade this island, which I'm sure they will, I want you to save 3 bullets in your gun, Mrs. Moore said to the Marine. Stanley and I looked at each other. What was she talking about? Ma'am, the Marine said, clearly as confused as we were. I don't want those Japanese monsters to take us alive, Charlie's mom said, her voice low and serious. When you have killed my 2 children, you will then shoot me. I reared back in horror. Kill her? And Charlie? And Charlie's little sister? Just so they wouldn't be taken prisoner by Japanese soldiers? Beside me, Stanley looked shell-shocked. As horrified as I was, he had to be double so, triple, because Mrs. Moore would think he was a monster too. Yes, ma'am, the Marine said. As soon as Charlie's mom went back inside, I grabbed Stanley by the sleeve and dragged him toward the entrance. We acted like we hadn't heard anything, but I saw the Marine giving Stanley a suspicious glance as we passed him. Stanley, I said, trying to think of something I could say to make him feel better, but the crestfallen look on his face told me there was nothing I could do. Frank, I've been looking all over for you, Ginny said, appearing right in front of me and giving me a hug. Where's Brooks? Is he all right? The truth. I blinked and pulled away from Ginny. She'd caught me off guard. No. I still didn't know what to say. I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to tell Ginny that Brooks was dead. I looked up at Stanley, and he quickly looked away. I started. You were with him on the Utah, weren't you? Ginny cut in. One of the sailors said the Utah was hit. What happened? It's hard to say, I told her. I mean, it happened so quick. Stanley looked at me and frowned. What? I thought. It was so easy to say. Why didn't he tell her? But he was okay when you left him, right? Ginny asked. I so wanted to say yes, to lie to her, and pretend that Brooks had been alive the last time we'd seen him. Ginny would just find out later that he was dead, after the battle, from somebody else. The sooner she knew, the longer she'd have to miss him, right? Lying to her now would actually be doing her a favor. I would be saving her extra anguish. This was nonsense, and I knew it. Besides, I could never lie like that to Ginny. Not after her so many moves where we were each other's only friend. We'd learned to always be honest with each other, even if the truth hurt. Ginny, the Utah got hit with torpedoes and capsized, I told her. Brooks helped us get off the ship. But then, Ginny, Brooks is dead. Ginny froze. What? No, she said. He can't be dead. Mom would have told me before now. You would have told me before now, she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge as her eyes welled up. Mom doesn't know, I said, and I was scared to tell you. I didn't know how. I'm sorry, Ginny. She didn't know how sorry. No, it was somebody else, Ginny decided, sniffing back tears. It was chaos, just like here. Everybody in uniform, covered in oil. It'd be an easy mistake to make. I looked at Stanley, silently pleading with him to back me up. We saw his face, Stanley said quietly. It was him. Ginny was suddenly frantic. She turned for the door. Are you sure he was dead? Maybe he was just hurt. He might need our help. I held her back. No, Ginny, no, I said. I didn't know what else to say that I hadn't said already. Stanley and I knew what we saw. Brooks was dead. Ginny could see the grief in my eyes, and we were all quiet as the truth of it finally sank in. Ginny sat down right where she was and put her hands to her mouth and sobbed. It was almost like she had already known something bad had happened, or guessed. It was hard to see the wounded sailors around us and imagine anyone making it out all right. Stanley and I sat down with her. Japanese planes continued to drone outside. Across the harbor, something detonated with a deep, bone-shaking boom. And then smaller kids ran to one of the bunker's old gun slits to see what was happening on Battleship Row. Navy wives cleaned black oil from sailors who moaned and worried and wept. Me? I sat mesmerized in the middle of all of it, Ginny crying softly beside me and wondering if Stanley hadn't been right, that maybe we were all living in one of the Sandman's nightmares. Did he suffer? My sister asked finally, surprising me. No, I don't think so, I said truthfully. It happened so fast. I couldn't imagine it had taken long for him to die. But I didn't say that to Ginny. She nodded through her tears. My heart broke for her. Ginny had loved Brooks. I knew that. And now he was gone. Because of me. Ginny, I'm so sorry, I said, tears running down my face. It's my fault Brooks is dead. What? Ginny said to me, looking appalled. It's not, Stanley said. It is, I said. I froze up, and Brooks had to go back to me. He would have been somewhere else when that bullet came. Should have been somewhere else. Might have been somewhere else, said Stanley. If Brooks hadn't gone back for you, he might have been hit by shrapnel from the rally, or killed by tracer wounds, or been shot when he jumped in the water, he went on, sounding like me all of a sudden. If we hadn't come to visit the ship in the first place, he might have been trapped inside the Utah when it flipped. Stop, Ginny said. And Stanley looked sick when he realized he'd been listing all the ways Brooks could have died, with Ginny sitting right there. We don't have time for this, Ginny told us, lifting her chin. We have to get out there and help more sailors make it up here to the dungeon. We have to what? I said. Think about all those sailors out there trying to stay alive, Ginny said. Hurt, burned, lost, choking on oil, drowning. We can save them. I shook my head. Now that we were safely tucked away in the dungeon, I planned to stay for a long, long time. Ginny, we've been out there, I told her. It's bad. Really bad. We go out there again, we're going to get killed. Ginny grabbed my arm. But they need us, Frank, she said. The people who love those sailors need us, to make sure they come home. I suddenly understood. It wasn't just about saving sailors. It was about Brooks. Ginny couldn't be there for him when he needed her, and now she was determined to be there for somebody else. Anybody else. Just one sailor, Frank, Ginny said, tears streaming down her face again. If we could save just one sailor, that would be enough. Ginny, I get it, I said, but we can't. Wait, listen, Stanley said. We all looked up at the concrete ceiling, like that would help us hear better. I shook my head. I didn't hear anything. Then my eyes went wide. I didn't hear anything. Not the dull thuds of Japanese bombs, not the drone of Japanese planes, not the flip-flip-blip of Japanese tracer rounds. The attack is over, Ginny cried. I don't believe it, I said. Unless the air raid is over because the ground invasion has started. No, listen. There's barely any shooting, Ginny said. All we could hear now was the occasional pop and boom of anti-aircraft shell. Barely any shooting is still some shooting, I protested. Ginny dragged her arm across her eyes and stood. Come on, she told us. Let's go help the sailors in the water. Stanley got to his feet. I'm in, he said. I'm ready to get out of here. He shot a glance at Mrs. Moore across the room. She'd been staring heat vision eyes at Stanley, and she quickly looked away. Stanley and Ginny headed for the door. Arg, why would anybody listen to me? Yes, I was usually the boy who cried wolf, but this time there really was a wolf out there. Or it might be, at least. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, but all I could see were Brooks's dead eyes staring back at me. With a heavy sigh, I got up and followed Ginny and Stanley outside. Oil and water. Down the hill from the dungeon, the edge of the water looked like the end of the world. Burned bodies were piled up on the rocky shore. Sailors lay dead in the grass. Bloody men moaned and writhed and called out for a medic, for a buddy, for their mother. It was so horrible it was almost unbelievable. My eyes watered and I coughed. I covered my nose and mouth with my arm to try to keep out the smoke, but it didn't help. There was fire everywhere. Houses burned, the grass burned, boats burned. Even the water was on fire, the top of it coated with a thick layer of black oil. The popping and cracking of the flames kept up a steady background buzz. But the attack at least did seem to be over. There were no more torpedoes, no more Zeros in the sky, no more towering geysers of water. Over here, Ginny called. I ran to where she was helping an oily figure crawl out of the water. He had burns and blisters all over the right side of his body, but otherwise, he could walk and talk. What ship are you from? Stanley asked as we helped him ashore. West Virginia, the sailor said, gasping. I reeled at that. The West Virginia was one of the biggest, newest battleships in the fleet. Is she sunk? I asked. Don't know, he said. Jap planes came right at us over the water and dropped torpedoes. They waited so long to pull up that they were lower than the crow's nest when they flew past. From his accent, I guessed the man was Filipino, but it was impossible to tell with all the oil covering him. Ginny tried to clean the ooze off his face with a rag. We got hit 5-6 times, the sailor went on. I was trapped by fire. Thought I was going to be burned alive. Then the Arizona went up, and it blew me and everybody else right off the deck and into the water. Put out the fire on the West Virginia, too. There are people who can help you just up the hill, Ginny told him. In the bunker underneath Admiral Bellinger's house. Do you know it? The sailor nodded and thanked us before lurching unsteadily up the hill. I looked around to see a dozen more people, some sailors, some civilians, also helping to pull men from the water. The survivors were covered in oil, or were only slightly wounded, were sent up the hill to the Navy moms in the dungeon. The sailors, who were badly injured, were loaded into launches bound for the medical ship Solace or to the hospital on the mainland. The dead were dragged aside to be buried later. Ginny and Stanley and I worked alongside the others, grim-faced and silent. Ginny was trying to bury her grief over Brooks, I guessed. Stanley was probably trying to bury his misery over how things had changed for him. Me, I stayed numb on purpose. Otherwise, if I let myself really think about what I was doing, I'd run screaming for the hills. A sailor I helped out of the water grabbed hold of my arm and wouldn't let go. Have they got out the Panama Canal yet? He asked. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about that, I said. I heard Washington's been bombed, the sailor told me. They said the Japs invaded San Francisco and are halfway to Sacramento. Who said that? I asked. The sailor didn't answer. He couldn't. I sent him on his way up to the dungeon and turned back to the water where another sailor floated upside down. A sailor wearing a white baseball uniform. I shook my head and blinked. Brooks, I said. Just one. Ginny heard me, and her head whipped around. Brooks, where? No, Ginny, I said, immediately realizing my mistake. It couldn't be Brooks. Brooks was dead. There was no way his body could have floated all the way around Ford Island and ended up here. Wait, I cried. But it was too late. Ginny was already crashing through the smoke and the oily water toward the sailor. Stanley and I hurried after her. Ginny got to the man first and flipped him over. It wasn't Brooks. I knew it couldn't be. There was a young white sailor in a white baseball uniform, this one with the words Submarine Squadron 4 sewn onto the chest. The other team the Utahs were going to play. He had horrible cuts all over his face and arms. "Help me get him to shore," Ginny cried. Together we dragged the man out of the harbor and laid him on his back in the mud. Thought for sure the sailor was dead. But Ginny cleaned his nose and mouth with the hem of her shirt, and a moment later he was gasping for breath. We turned the man on his side, and he vomited up a stomachful of seawater and oil. Stanley and I cringed, but Ginny was locked in like a submarine captain with a periscope. "He's not burned, but he's got shrapnel wounds from head to foot," Ginny said, giving him a cursory examination. "He's bleeding a lot. This isn't something they can clean and bandage up in the dungeon. He needs to get to a hospital." A boat full of wounded sailors was pulling away from Ford Island, and I ran into the water after it, waving my arms. "Wait! Stop! We've got one more!" I cried. But they waved me off. They were already full. I looked around for another boat, but couldn't see one in the smoke. Another could come along any minute, or another 20 minutes. There was no telling. "If this man doesn't get to a hospital soon, he's going to die," Ginny said. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "We have to help him, Frank." "Ginny," I said as gently as I could, "he's not Brooks." "I know," she said, "but he could have been." I nodded. "I get it," I told her. "I just don't know what to do." "Our boat!" Stanley cried. "We could take him to the Solace ourselves." I blinked in surprise. Of course. The little boat Stanley and I took back and forth to the mainland was tied up nearby. "Not the Solace," Ginny said. "That's where everybody's going. They've got to be overwhelmed. If they're not sunk, we've got to take him to the base hospital on the mainland." She nodded decisively. Stanley stood up and nodded too. "Ginny, can you tell our moms where we went? They'll be upset, but they'll understand." Whoa, I said. "Ships are still sinking and exploding out there. The water between here and the hospital is on fire." "Just one," Ginny told me. "Frank, we have to save just one." "We've saved more than one," I told her. "This one," Ginny told me. Stanley waited. I closed my eyes and bowed my head. There were so many ways to get hurt out there on Pearl Harbor that there was no use listing them. But then there was Ginny, and Stanley, and Brooks, and this sailor who would die if we didn't get him to a hospital. "Okay," I told Stanley at last. "Go get the boat." Battleship Row. I gripped the sides of the boat and took a deep breath as we pulled away from Ford Island. Stanley was at the tiller, and he steered us southwest. He had to go slow to avoid the patches of burning oil and the dead bodies that floated on the harbor. The wounded sailor in the bottom of our boat stirred and groaned. I fished his dog tags out from under his baseball jersey and read his name. Kowalski Joseph H. His dog tags said he had type A blood and that he had a tetanus shot earlier this year, which was good because with all the metal that was sticking out of him, he was going to need it. That and a lot of type A blood. "Hey, this guy's a real submariner," Stanley said, pointing to the Submarine Squadron 4 on his chest. "You know, like Namor." I nodded. Though I could barely think about comics right now, through the roiling smoke clouds to our left, I could see the submarine base where Kowalski Joseph H. must have come from. Up above it, on the mainland, were the base's oil storage tanks. Both the sub-base and the oil tanks were miraculously intact. To our right was Battleship Row, or what was left of it. Every ship was taking at least one bomb or torpedo, and most of them looked like they'd been hit multiple times. The Arizona burned like a giant bonfire, the flames so hot that even at this distance, Stanley and I had to duck low in our boat to not get burned. The West Virginia had got sunk straight down, like the Raleigh, and had pinned the battleship that was berthed alongside it against its moorings. The repair ship Vestal was listing and threatening to sink, and the little tugs and garbage scows were everywhere, spraying water hoses in futile attempts to put some of the bigger ships out the bigger ships' fires. But it was the Oklahoma that made me and Stanley truly gasp. The huge battleship had gone belly up, just like the Utah. But the Oklahoma was no retired ship used for target practice. The Oklahoma was part of the backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Everybody's going to hate me now, Stanley said quietly as we watched sailors trying to cut their crewmates out of the Oklahoma with acetylene torches. Me and my mom, because we look like the people who did this. It's not your fault, or your mom's, or any other Japanese American on these islands, I told him. Stanley shook his head. It doesn't matter, he said. I knew there was nothing I could say that would make Stanley feel any better, because he was right. All that would matter was that he looked Japanese. Stanley kept steering us slowly and carefully around the widening oil fires, through a maze of broken whaleboats, deck timbers, empty life vests, and dark shapes that might have been bodies. It was best not to look too closely at any of it, just in case. A bunch of little white fabric things floated on the surface of the water like paper boats, and I snatched one from the water to see what it was. It was a hat, a round white sailor cap. There were hundreds of them, all with their owners' names stenciled on them in dark, stark black ink. Davenport, Goggin, Wilcox, Jones, Talbert, Temple, Castro, Finnegan, Pribble, Rice. There were more and more hats and more names. After a while, I had to stop reading. It was too much. The drone of approaching plane made Stanley and me exchange a frightened look. We searched the sky, but couldn't see for all the smoke. Was it one of our planes or one of theirs? It had to be one of ours. The attack on Pearl Harbor was over, wasn't it? A Japanese plane burst out of the smoke, flying low and slow across the water, and my stomach lurched. No, not again. Stanley and I ducked, but the pilot wasn't shooting bullets. He was shooting pictures. He had a boxy camera in his hands, and I saw him point it this way and that. Taking pictures of his visit to Hawaii like tourists, Stanley said sourly. Boom. I jumped as an American ship on the mainland side of the harbor opened fire on the plane, and then suddenly, every ship on both sides of the harbor was shooting at it. Stanley and I ducked again as the bullets and artillery shells flew right overhead. Those papayas aren't careful. They're going to shoot each other, Stanley cried. Or us, I yelled. Certainly none of them hit the Zero. The plane slid slowly by, completely unbothered by all the gunfire. Stanley picked up the canteen of water I kept in the boat for emergencies and chucked it at the passing plane. If Zero had looked close enough for him and to hit it, but the plane was long gone before the canteen splashed harmlessly into the harbor. I turned my palms up and gave Stanley a look that said, "What are you doing?" "Sorry," Stanley said, chagrined. "I was just kind of mad." I had to nod. I felt the same way, mad and helpless. But we were doing something, weren't we? We were taking Kowalski, Joseph H., to base hospital. I checked to make sure he was still breathing, and he was. Barely. We needed to be faster. Over the chug of the boat's motor, I heard a high-pitched whine. Stanley and I looked up at the same time. High in the sky, something that looked like a swarm of black mosquitoes was buzzing down toward us. As they got closer, the mosquitoes became little black buzzards. Then, like little khaki planes. No, I said. I sank as low to the bottom of the boat as I could go, the weight of despair pinning me down. "Holy cats!" Stanley cried, and he dropped down beside me. It was more Japanese planes, with bright red meatballs on the underside of their wings. Dozens of them. Hundreds. I stared up, frozen with horror, as little egg-shaped things detached from the planes and whistled down toward the mainland and Ford Island. More bombs. I cowered as explosions ripped through 1010 Dock and Battleship Row, and the Japanese planes swooped level and started shooting again. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't over. It was only the first wave that had ended. The second wave had just begun.